Meeting.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this meeting, although the subject is decidedly a cool one. We have as guests this afternoon the Falkland Islands Philatelic Study Group and members from the Polar Postal History Society. A very warm welcome to you too. I have no announcements to make at this stage. As Mark has said, the display will be recorded, and if you wish to ask questions, then please use the chat facility, which you will see the appropriate tab at the foot of your screens. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Kim Stuckey. Kim is a fellow of the Royal Philatelic Society, London. He's also a member of council, and he's president of the Falkland Islands Philatelic Study Group. Without any further ado, then, Kim, over to you for your presentation on British ice.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see that? Mark,
yep,
everything fine?
It looks good to me.
Okay, thank you. Well, welcome to a presentation of tales of British pluck and daring do in the icy cold waste of Antarctica. You're going to hear tales of Bovril and tales of Huntley and Palmer golden puffs as we go through. You will also see mention of a Rolex watch, and you will meet Dick Barton, special agent, during this presentation as well.
Oh.
We start with a view of probably not the nicest task in the world, being underneath a TransAntarctic Expedition snowcat, wedged in a crevasse attempting to cross the continent in the 1950s. Next slide, please, Mike. Britain had generally ignored what was called the Falkland Islands Dependencies through the 1930s. Whaling and the revenue from the licensing of whaling had declined as shore stations closed and the Great Depression hit. As World War II broke out, the military especially was worried about the use of the Falklands or the Dependencies as a colony and supply base to move between the Pacific and Atlantic. There was a further concern about the undefended and uninhabited Antarctic area, and that could become subject to territorial claims from both Argentina and Chile. At the same time, the US was also active in the area, especially after the end of the war. Britain really needed to demonstrate its sovereignty over the area. Now, that could be done with the sciences such as cartography and meteorology, but even more important, physical bases. If these had a postal service, even better. Next slide. I'm not going to say much about Operation Tabrin, partly because it was in the 1940s, and partly because it's a subject that probably deserves a presentation in its own right. But this was the military operation, which eventually became the Falkland Islands Dependencies Survey, known as FIDS, through the 1950s. It established 3 new Antarctic bases at Port Lockroy, Deception Island, and in the South Orkney Islands, and also linked to the existing British administrative base at South Georgia. Each of these new bases opened a post office, and Falkland Island stamps were overprinted to use at these post offices. Importantly, mail was posted both to Chile and to Argentina to in effect prove that the mail from the dependencies would be handled by their postal service. Here is an example of one of these envelopes sent to Buenos Aires, the second item in the list from the letter shown to the left, from the naval attaché there. Next slide. Now, the 1950s were a time of rapid base expansion, mainly along the Antarctic Peninsula, and it reached its peak number in the late 1950s. The location of the bases, and each of them was designated by a base letter, can be seen in the map here. During this period, 2 further stamp issues were also made. What was called the Dependencies Map Set, which had 2 issues, the thick map in 1946 and the thin map in 1948. This was followed by the beautiful 2-colour recess printed Dependencies Ship Set in 1954. Various commemoratives such as Victory, Silver Wedding, UPU and Coronation Omnibus issues were made for the Dependencies as well. Let's take a look at some of the base mail during that expansion period. At the same time, commercial mail is quite difficult for us to find, with us talking about 100 or so base personnel in total, even at the peak of expansion. Next slide. And we start with what might be a pretty common twopence halfpenny Commonwealth surface rate cover, and that's sent from Admiralty Bay in the South Shetlands, and it's sent in 1958. That's a pretty ordinary envelope, but a nice addressee to Robert Lorry, who made specialist boots for mountaineering and skiing in London. It's nice to think that the correspondence from a base member about these boots could even have been an order. And just to show you in terms of commercial mail, there were 8 people at Argentine Islands in the base that season. Next slide. Now, this is what I consider value for money postage. A halfpenny here allows you to send a Christmas and New Year card from the Argentine Islands on the Antarctic Peninsula at Commonwealth surface printed matter rate all the way to New Zealand. Now, the downside to this rate is it took over a year to arrive. I suspect it wasn't picked up until the end of the summer season in March, April time, then went all the way back up to the UK and then onwards by ship to New Zealand. And you can see it contained a Christmas and New Year card. There were some very attractive cards produced for FIDS each year to send as Christmas cards. Next slide. The next couple of slides look at an interesting concept you could imagine if you're in a base on the Antarctic Peninsula, airmail. Now, what would actually happen with airmail? It would consist of a supply or relief ship taking your mail, probably firstly to Port Stanley. There it would go on the Falklands mail and supply ship, either the Fitzroy or the Darwin, to Montevideo. There it would be put on a flight to the UK. So your airmail would have an absolute minimum of a week before it even reached an aircraft. There are 2 examples here. Firstly, second-class airmail from Marguerite Bay. Second-class airmail wasn't officially introduced in the Falklands and Dependencies until 1966, but here it's seen earlier at the 6-penny rate. Secondly, we have a 10-gram weight cover, which should be 2 shillings, and that's sent from Port Lockroy. Now, only 1 and 6 is on the cover, so an insufficient postage for carriage by air cachet was applied in Stanley, and the unfortunate item was switched to surface mail sent by ship. Next slide. 2 more examples of airmail. An air letter, first of all, at the 6-penny aerogram rate from Hope Bay base, and that was sent by base leader Amet officer Lofty Warswick, and I think he was quite a tall chap, as you can see in the photograph here. Now, the address is nice on this air letter, being Guernsey. A very unusual airmail type from a base was an airmail postcard. Again, no official rate in the Falklands or Dependencies existed until 1974 this time. But in general, airmail postcards were sent at the 5-gram airmail rate of a shilling. And this example is from the geologist at Hope Bay in 1962. Next slide. Most of the bases, as they were opened up, had their base name on the cancellors, as we've seen previously. However, some of the smaller bases had just the base letter. They were shown, the letters were shown on that map we saw earlier, and their base letters were on the canceller here. A rule of thumb is that commercial mail with a base letter cancel are pretty scarce. Here we see 2 examples. One is an air letter with cancelled base W, the Lubay Coast base, sent by radio operator Eric Broom at the 6-penny aerogram rate. The other mail is to a collector, but contains a letter thanking him for the items that he had sent in the mail to the base personnel. This is on base notepaper and cancelled with base O, which are on the Danco coast. Next slide. Having seen some examples of mail from the rapid expansion of the FIDS bases in the 1950s, we now take a look at the expeditions that promoted mapping, and scientific research through the 1950s in the Antarctic. These were again vital to demonstrate sovereignty over the area by Britain. Although South Georgia had been used for whaling, with licenses issued by the British since 1909, the island had never been seriously mapped. Over 3 summers in the 1950s, surveyors and glaciologists mapped areas of this mountainous island. Now, the expeditions were led by Duncan Cass, who's pictured on the right in this photograph here. Now, some of you may recognize the name. He was the actor who played Dick Barton, special agent on the radio in the late 1940s. But here he is leading survey expeditions to South Georgia. Now, Cass is pictured with Louis Bohm. Now, he was a member of the watchmaking family, and it was Louis Bohm, who was again a surveyor, who sent this cover in 1956 from the expedition. Next slide. Now, the second expedition we discuss is the British South Georgia expedition. This was a private expedition with a focus on mountaineering, and it had 4 members of the Oread Mountaineering Club from Derbyshire, together with an RAF doctor and experienced climber in the Alps and the Cairngorms, Ian Brooker. Now, they managed to persuade Salverson's whaling company to give them cheap passage on a whale oil tanker, Southern Opal. Here they're photographed leaving Glasgow. They got sponsorship from the Daily Telegraph and others such as the Everest Foundation. It also required some negotiation for support from suppliers to the expedition. And here we have an example from Bovril, who gave them 25% discount on an inordinate amount of Bovril expeditionary pemmican, which consists, I think, of tallow, fruits and meat all sort of pounded together, providing sustenance for mountaineers and Antarctic explorers. But they certainly took a lot with them. Next slide. Now, the main focus of the expedition was, as I said, to climb the peaks in South Georgia. But the expedition also had surveyors, and they assisted Cass with the surveys for his mapping. Now, they had an unusual home, you might think, for an expedition, the jail at South Georgia. In fact, it was often used as an expedition base. Now, families would be able to send inward mail via routes knowing which ship was planning to go to South Georgia. So in this case, there was an aerogram to Ian Brooker, the expedition doctor, and that was sent by the expedition agents, Wilson, Sons and Co. in Montevideo, and then it was taken on board the supply ship SS Harpon, and you can see that's indicated on the aerogram. Next slide. Now, aerograms the other way. Here are 2 examples of air letters that were sent by Ian Brooker. One on the left to his wife, one on the right to his mother. The aerogram rate was sixpence, and they should really only carry a single 6penny stamp. That was the rules on air letters. But here, aerograms with 3 stamps were accepted. I don't know if that was a shortage of 6penny stamps at the time or some other reason. But these air letters were probably carried north by whale oil tankers that headed north during the season, and they were either put into the mail at Stanley or at Montevideo directly, or even someplace like Aruba. Next slide. I mentioned the Daily Telegraph as a sponsor. Here, the expedition leader, George Sutton, has sent a field report to Colin Coote, the editor of the Telegraph. He's used one of the printed expedition envelopes. Now, Sutton's also photographed here. He's making an attempt on the summit of Mount Sugartop, which is 7,628 feet high on South Georgia. Now, the party failed to make the summit of either Sugartop or an attempt on Mount Paget, which at 9,629 feet is the highest mountain on South Georgia. They failed to make both, but they claimed several slightly lower peaks. with their climbing. Now, this particular envelope was damaged in transit and was resealed either by the Stanley or British Post Office, because the Post Office in the Falklands used the same resealing tape as the UK, so we're not certain where that was resealed. Next slide. Another example of airmail from the expedition. This one is from the expedition deputy leader, and he was also surveyor, Harry Pretty, and that's to his wife Molly. She was the secretary for the expedition back in Derbyshire. They're pictured here at an Oriad club dinner in 1956. Next slide. And the final example from this expedition is the cover here from Ian Brooker to his wife. And that's sent at the 3-shilling 15-gram airmail rate. Also pictured is the expedition party at South Georgia, modelling what is a nice line of expedition leisure wear, I think you'll see here, with the BSGE, British South Georgia Expedition, embroidered on their sweaters. Next slide. The next expedition also certainly took some bravery, flying over the Antarctic Peninsula in a Catalina flying boat from a base at Deception Island. This was the Falkland Islands and Dependencies Aerial Survey Expedition, or FIDAISY as it was known. It lasted for 2 Antarctic summers in 1955 to 56 and 1956 to 57. So we're talking about the period from late October through to about March, the Antarctic summer. You can see an airmail envelope from one of the surveyors, Colin Brown, sent at the 20-gram airmail rate with an expedition label. Next slide. Now, the British Colonial Office funded the expedition and gave the contract to Hunting Aero Surveys to map the Antarctic Peninsula. And incidentally, they mapped the Falkland Islands also, and it was those maps that went forward to be used in the 1982 conflict. But this mapping would certainly support the British claim for sovereignty over the peninsula. Now, in addition to the aerial survey in the Catalina flying boats, a helicopter was flown from the expedition ship, and they put down surveyors to measure trig points to assist with the mapping. Peter Mott, who's pictured bottom right there, led the expedition, and they set up their hut next to the FIDS base at Deception Island. Much of the first season consisted of setting up this base and building a taxiway to get the Canadian Catalina flying boats, known as Cansos, out of the water. A nice expedition label, which you can see on the left there, was produced for members to use on their mail home. The bulk of the aerial surveying was completed in the second season, and this time they used a cachet on expedition mail. Next slide. In the bottom left here, you can see a picture of the 2 Canso aircraft out of the water at Deception Island. Now, Deception is a huge volcano caldera in the ocean, where about 500 meters of the wall has collapsed and let the sea in. You can see it just at the bottom right of the small aerial photograph. The island looks small there, but in fact is about 12 kilometers in diameter. The expedition mail was handled by the FIDS base commander. Now, he wasn't a postal expert, and at one point he was adding 2.5 halfpenny to the airmail fee, which was a shilling every 5 grams, to cover the surface mail rate to Montevideo. Of course, this additional surface charge was not needed. But that's why you see this 30-gram airmail actually paying 6 and 2.5 halfpenny for its postage, but a nice use there of the 1954 ship's 5-shilling stamp. Next slide. The expedition ship, the Olaf Sven, brought the expedition hut, helicopter and supplies from Tilbury down to Deception. It also brought down a considerable amount of aviation spirit, so much so that hobnail boots on deck were banned. Here is a cover from Captain Jan Rigger back to his wife in Denmark. Now, remember in the last presentation, it was unfortunately not sent to a telephone kiosk. But there's a small ship of the Cachet in violet. The helicopter flew off the ship, which was some really good flying in the Antarctic, given the weather conditions in open seas. Next slide. Now let's look at some mail from expedition members. Here is a cover from pilot Jim Greenshields in the first season, who was sent at the 10-gram airmail rate with an expedition label. Now, you might notice the envelope. It was used from taken from the Myrtle Beach Hotel, Jamaica. Of course, the aircraft had to fly down from Canada, and they certainly stopped at some warmer destinations before reaching Port Stanley. And then they had a 1,300-kilometre haul to Deception Island, to the base there. Next slide. Next is a colourful cover from pilot Chris Gavin Robinson to his son at school back in England. And that's again sent at the 10-gram airmail rate, but the FIDS postmaster has wrongly added, as I said, the twopence halfpenny surface mail rate. Gavin Robinson is pictured centre in a publicity photo that was taken for Huntley and Palmer Golden Puff biscuits. He seems to be enjoying them. Next slide. The helicopter pilot in both seasons was Bim Jakes. Here he is pictured piloting the Bell 47D helicopter. It had good visibility. It's a different helicopter to the one they used in the first season, which had poor visibility, but this had this perspex bubble. But as you can see, just an opening and no doors. Here's a cover to his wife. It was sent with the first season expedition label and at the 30-gram airmail rate. Next slide. Talking to the helicopters, the helicopter engineer was Brian Davey. On board ship, on the Olaf Sven, a clever folding hatch was constructed with a lift that allowed the helicopter to be lowered into the hold, making maintenance easier. Now, unfortunately, in this second season, the helicopter crashed on Tower Island in a whiteout, but both Bim Jakes and surveyor John Noble were unhurt. But the helicopter was a write-off and required a voyage to Montevideo to pick up a new helicopter. Brian Davey here is sending a letter to his parents in the second season at the 10-gram airmail rate, again with that surface mail rate added again. Notice especially here, there's a small version of the expedition Cachet, which was used in the second season in black. And that was a Cachet rarely seen on expedition mail, but they obviously had the two Cachets there. But as I say, scarce to see on the expedition mail. Next slide. You could imagine back at head office in Boreham Wood, they were probably worrying about Hunting Aero Survey's work going on some 8,500 miles away in the Antarctic. Here's a cover back to the managing director of Hunting Aero Surveys, Frank Wills. He'd formed the first aerial photography company in the UK in 1919 called Aero Films. And that was acquired by Hunting Aviation in 1942 to become Hunting Aero Surveys. Now, this letter was sent by Peter Mott just after the Tower Island helicopter crash, and he was probably considering if the expedition could continue. It's sent at the 1 shilling 5-gram airmail rate, and again we see the wrong addition of the surface rate. And here you see the more commonly seen larger second season expedition Cachet applied in violet. Next slide. Now, my personal favourite item of expedition mail is showing this part of an A4 sized envelope. I couldn't fit it all on the screen here. Sending documents back to hunting aero surveys. Two things really appeal to me on this. The first is the scarce commercial use of the ship's 10-shilling stamp for such a weight of mail. Now, the second is the tortuous calculation that must have been done by the FIDS base leader, Percy Guyver, to work out this airmail rate. The airmail rate is metric and was done on grams, so that's 12 shillings for 60 grams. But then wrongly adding the surface rate, he had to work out the calculation for that, which is imperial. And the weight takes it above the 1 ounce limit for surface mail of 2.5 halfpenny. So a 5p double rate for up to 2 ounces is used. So the total 12 and 5p requirement for franking is indicated in ink above the stamps. Next slide. Not the most obvious visitor you would expect to the expedition, but the Duke of Edinburgh arrived on the 3rd of January 1957 on board Britannia as part of his round the world tour after opening the 1956 Olympics in Australia. He had already visited bases on the Antarctic Peninsula, then after Deception Island, headed for the Falklands, South Georgia, Tristan da Cunha and St Helena. And Prince Philip had lunch at the FIDS base with the FIDS team, but also the Aero Survey expedition members. He then invited them all on board Britannia in the evening, and they watched 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. So here's a cover sent on the 3rd of January, the same day as he arrived, and again using the smaller expedition cachet. Next slide. So that's the end of the aerial survey expedition, but there was a small expedition that was linked to the aerial survey work. And that was a Royal Navy hydrographic survey in 1956-57 and 1957-58. And that tried to understand the channel depths and the underwater topography around the Antarctic Peninsula. Small motorboats were used, and mail from this expedition is quite scarce with the number of members involved. And here, however, here you can see an example using an expedition printed envelope. And the Navy News also carried an article where they're just off Port Lockroy here. Next slide. Now, in the latter half of the 1950s, 2 major Antarctic expeditions took place at similar times. The first is probably the more well-known TransAntarctic Expedition, which was led by Vivian Fuchs and Edmund Hillary, and they had the objective of crossing the continent. The second expedition was the International Geophysical Year Expedition. That was sponsored by the Royal Society, and it promoted scientific work, especially scientific work on the ionosphere. Now, I'm showing mainly International Geophysical Year material here, and a little bit of the TransAntarctic Expedition. I was very lucky to get hold of some scrapbooks from the cook on the expedition, on the IGY expedition, Malcolm Edwards. The postal material was stuck down on very fibrous 1950s scrapbook paper, and probably stuck in using what we all remember, probably Gloy glue. Now, Mike Roberts from Ilkley provided great help in restoring the material, and that was particularly difficult where you had flimsy air letters stuck to the scrapbook, but he did a great job. Now, the 2 expeditions left for the Antarctic together on the ship Magadan, and Her Majesty the Queen visited the ship before it sailed. Next slide. Now, the 2 expeditions were going to use new bases which were built on the ice shelf in Coates Land. So there needed to be advanced parties that constructed the huts while they themselves lived in tents. Now, the IGY advanced party was led by Surgeon Captain David Dalgleish. The advance party ship, the Theron, got stuck in the ice, and the IGY party decamped there and built their base further north of their intended target, Vassal Bay, at what became named Halley Bay. So here's a cover from Dalglish, stating he was only supplied with the 4 TransAntarctic Expedition stamps on the cover. And he also, as you can see at the top, altered his pre-printed stationery to say Halley Bay. And you can see this cover is also cancelled using the new IGY canceller used during the expedition at Halley Bay. Next slide. Now, Halley Bay base was surrounded by large crevasses, so it wasn't really suitable for the snowcats of the TransAntarctic Expedition, as we saw on the title slide how they could get into trouble. Fuchs took the Theron further south and was nearly completely trapped in the ice. He left 8 men to build Shackleton Basement and managed eventually to extricate the ship. Now, the people left at the base constructing it had a torrid time, losing a large amount of stores from ice breaking and living in tents and the tractor crate while the hut was eventually constructed through the blizzards. Here's a cover from the opening of the Shackleton Post Office on the 30th of January 1956 with a nice ship cachet of the Theron and the new Shackleton base cancel. Next slide. So eventually the main party arrived. Here's a picture of Halley Bay base, and here's a cover at the Commonwealth surface rate of 2.5 halfpenny sent by the cook, Malcolm Edwards, to his parents in Kenton. There was a Royal Society Halley Bay cachet used on some mail, and it's seen here. Next slide. There was airmail again from the expedition, and 2 examples are known. Of course, airmail in this case was dependent on the odd passing icebreaker or waited a long time for a relief ship to arrive. Here's an air letter at the 6-penny rate from Malcolm Edwards to his parents. And then there's an airmail. The TAE set was often used to pay the airmail rate of a shilling, even though it meant a letter was a halfpenny overpaid. Here is a cover from Les Barclay, our atmospherics chap, to his son. Both covers received the Royal Society cachet. Next slide. At the start, I mentioned Rolex watches, and this is why. All the members of the IGY party received a watch, and you can see David Dalglish providing some advertorial for Rolex, singing the praises of the watches. It appears that the watches were handed back from the party when the expedition ended. But here is a letter to Malcolm Edwards from the managing director in the UK, telling him he would receive his watch, which was following shortly. A nice touch from the company. Next slide. There are also some unusual ways that messages could get back home. One opportunity to the available to the expedition party, as well as the other FIDS bases, was to radio a message to the Met Office at Stanley. They would type the message onto an aerogram and send it airmail via Montevideo back home. There's an example here. Of course, you're going to see a Falkland Islands 6-penny stamp rather than a Dependencies one, as it was sent from Stanley. Note also at the bottom of the air letter, upside down in the view, the Met Office Falkland Islands cachet. A strange route for mail was provided when an Argentine Navy icebreaker called at Halley Bay. The party took the opportunity to dash off a letter home. I suspect that all the letters were bagged and sealed because the letter was eventually posted in London. Perhaps the meter mark is from the Royal Society. At this time, Argentina was known to interfere with Falklands mail and stamps, so perhaps that explains the approach taken. Next slide. There was also opportunity to send telegram messages. It's quite nice to see the greetings telegram form used with the Halley Bay Antarctica originating office at the top there. The telegram was sent just before the final relief ship, Totten, arrived for the party after they'd spent 2 years in the expedition at Halley Bay. Next slide. So, as I say, after 2 successful years of scientific experiments, the Totten took the party home, with the IGY post office closing on the 12th of January 1959. Here we see a last telegram from Malcolm Edwards to his parents sent on the 12th. The cover I show is from the day before, the 11th, but has nice usage again of the 10-shilling ship stamp, paying part of the 60-gram airmail rate. Now, Halley Bay Base was actually then taken over by FIDS, and the FIDS post office opened with a Halley Bay canceller on the 13th of January. Malcolm Edwards says the old IGY canceller was filed away, never to be used again. Next slide. Meanwhile, the TransAntarctic Expedition was successful. Fuchs crossed the continent from Shackleton Base to Scott Base in the Ross Dependency, using his snowcats and other means, being helped with aircraft supply as well. There was also a crossing of the Antarctic by plane on the 6th of January 1958. Amazingly, a small de Havilland Otter aircraft. And this cover was sent by the radio operator on that flight, Taffy Williams, and with an enclosed letter. And next slide. And we come to the last slide here, and we finish our presentation back on South Georgia with Duncan Cass, our Dick Barton special agent. Cass was depressed after being overlooked for leadership of the TransAntarctic Expedition, and he wasn't even made a member of it. So he decided to embark on what he called an 18-month exercise in solitude at the isolated Undine Harbour. He leased that from the Crown for 1 shilling. He had no radio, and he was only likely to see a passing whaler or sealing boat. He landed 10 tons of stores and had to construct his own hut in February 1961. In May, a freak wave destroyed his hut completely and took most of his stores away. But luckily he was fortified by a salvage case of Burgundy, and he also had enough emergency rations, which meant he managed to survive until he was rescued by a sealer in September 1961. Here's a letter he sent to the US in March, which went from an unusual postbox. Cass said, "I am going to leave your envelopes in a poste restante calm and hope they will find it." Now, Duncan Cass returned in the 1970s to Undine Harbour to make a BBC film about his experiences. It's on YouTube and well worth watching. And with that, I've finished the display. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kim. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Mark. And Kim, thank you very much indeed for that superb presentation. I thought the opening slide of the snowcat was absolutely first class, and to see those commercial usages, particularly the two examples of the 10-shilling stamp, wonderful. Thank you very much indeed on behalf of everybody. Now we move to questions, and I'll hand back to Mark because he will be managing the questions. I think you've only got 3 items in the chat box at the moment.
Yes, I've got a few questions, but not too many at the moment. And I'm actually going to start with one that that relates to some of the people that we saw there, particularly at the end. This question is from Patrick Reed, and Patrick asks that he notes that the 1951 to 1956 expedition members were sporting pipes. Was smoking allowed in the cabins and communal areas?
Yes. Yeah, very much so. And you saw that in the sort of menus. They had incredible, I've got some examples actually, I must show sometime, of the menus that were constructed for celebrate things, obviously like Christmas Day, but also things like Midwinter's Day as well, which would be in June, I guess, down there. And yeah, that included all the sort of port and cigars at the end. Although I have to say that it's a very good point raised by Patrick, because of course all these huts were constructed out of wooden panels, and the fire risk was considerable, and there certainly were fires at the bases in the Antarctic Peninsula.
Yes, and as if that weren't bad enough, of course, in the 1960s, deception erupted.
Yeah.
Which didn't do the base any good there either. Right. Grace raises a question. Obviously, the Antarctic Treaty was drawn up, and part of the Antarctic Treaty said that the Antarctic should be used for peaceful purposes only. And Grace has what she describes as a boring first aid cover, which has on it a particular statement about that the Antarctic should be used for peaceful purposes only. She asks, can you suggest a source for any other more philatelically interesting items for her collection?
If it's the Antarctic, it's worth joining the Polar Postal History Society of Great Britain. Trevor will be very pleased that I'm doing an advert for them now, but they have auctions well, and obviously meetings where you could buy and swap material. But that's probably as good a source as any. And of course, there's a broad variety, because even on the Antarctic Peninsula, there Argentina and Chile have got bases as well. So there is still a dispute over the territorial rights of the British Antarctic Territory. So it's not just British mail in that area, but Argentinian bases as well. You can collect mail from. And then, of course, it goes round to New Zealand and their Antarctic Territory, and Australia as well, plus the French Antarctic.
Okay. Stephen Parkin is something I would say is quite eagle-eyed, because he asks the following question. He says, did somebody, possibly a postal historian, carve the word paid into the peaked iceberg that was behind the boat on the hydrographic survey slide?
I'll have to have a look. I can't remember that.
No, I can't remember either. So yeah, that's a very good question, Stephen.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And Charles Oppenheim says, asks a question, was someone appointed as postmaster at each base? And if so, how were they chosen?
Yeah, typically it was the base leader, because they were a deputy magistrate and deputy postmaster for the base. They often you'd have something like a base leader, for example, might be a diesel engine mechanic. So it wasn't anyone with any postal skills, and we see certainly an example of that with the Deception Island Tuppence Halfpenny surface mail rate being added. So there wasn't a specific postmaster sent down. Far later on, and we're talking in the 1980s, 1990s, there was a role of Antarctic postmen who would go down on the supply ships. They do things like take the first day covers down and frank them and collect the base mail. But at that time, it was the base leaders, typically, not always, but most of the time, it's the base leader who probably receive a file of instructions of these are the things that you do. And also there was some basic, it was pretty basic postal work. There was no registration facilities at the bases. If something was sent registered, it sometimes got registered in Stanley, but often might not get registered at all.
Thank you. I think, oh, have I got one more question? Let me just see. Okay, that was actually the last question I'm seeing, specifically about your talk. So I'd like to hand back to Richard, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark and Kim. It's now my great pleasure to invite Michael Roberts, the Vice President of the Society, to present the vote of thanks on behalf of everybody. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. The first thing I'd like to say is, like you, I wouldn't have liked to be the bloke in the crevasse under the the creeping thing that's trying to get across the Antarctic continent. Anyway, I've known Kim for a long time. I knew it would be a good presentation. We've had a joint interest in the Falklands and Falkland Island Dependencies for decades. Anyway, it's a very interesting and topical subject, and he's gone into great detail on the background to the history of the dependencies. It's well researched and very well presented, and I like the explanation of the expansion of the bases. Now, the postal history is very interesting in its own right, but to think that the subject matter in terms of the adhesives that you put on these covers, the Falkland Island Dependency ship set, which I regard as one of the last proper stamps, lovely designs. So that combined with the postal history, provided a unique piece of interest. And to be able to show, as you've already mentioned, not one, but 2 examples of the 10 shilling on cover, not to mention some of the other high values, is quite something. So, Kim, thank you very much. Well done, an excellent display.
Yeah. Very good.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike. I think everybody echoes the comments that you have made. We move now to the certificate.
Oh, yes, I have that.
Mark, you have the certificate.
So that you can present it, I will put it on the screen.
Thank you.
Okay.
Right, Kim, this is an image of the certificate that you will receive through the post as a permanent memento of your superb presentation this afternoon. Congratulations on behalf of everybody.
Thanks.
Now,
Okay.
that's, I think you're ceasing the recording now, are you?
I will do
Mark?
shortly.
Okay.
There's just one other thing, if I may add, Richard, if I could, which is mention of the new book that the Society is publishing. It's the De La Rue Inc. book, and it's available now for pre-order through our website. So it's very interesting, but it's the latest one that the Society's published. It's all about the ink recipes that De La Rue used for all of the, for the printing of all their stamps. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I've just got a couple of things to mention. The next meeting will take place on the 8th of April, and that will be a regional meeting. The Northwest region will present a selection of displays virtually. Also, Virtual Stampex has already been mentioned. We will be taking part in that, and that is from the 25th to the 27th of March. I now officially close the meeting, but we will stay and chat socially for the next 15-20 minutes, however long everyone wishes to do so. Thank you very much indeed for attending this excellent presentation. We had, I think, 166 fellows, members and guests in attendance. I think I've got that figure right because, Mark, you're nodding your head.
That sounds about right. Yes, thank you. And I'm now going to
Thank you very much indeed.
I'm now going to stop recording.